Bill Gates is the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Microsoft co-founder is one of the world's most well-known and most respected philanthropists. His organization's programs work across the globe in several key areas, including health, education, economic development, and gender equality.
I'm Andy Serwer, editor-in-chief of Yahoo Finance, and I'm joined by Bill Gates, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we're 7 months in, Bill, since the pandemic really hit the United States, late October. What's your assessment of how the U.S. has handled the pandemic?
Well, sadly, as we go into the fall, the number of cases and deaths is going to go back up again. And the reason those numbers are so high is partly because our response was very poor. Our testing, our messages about masks and social distancing make us near the bottom in terms of rich countries and how bad the epidemic has been.
Do you anticipate it getting even worse in the winter weather?
Yes, the amount of time you spend indoors, the fact that people are not getting clear messages and they're tired of the restrictions, and the fact that as it's colder, your upper respiratory tract doesn't do a good job of suppressing the virus. So your that seasonal transmission level is pretty clear in the data, and so all those things are working against us as we go into the fall.
Yeah, I know you're loath to call out people personally, including President Trump, for specific behaviors, but what can we do to convince people that maybe they shouldn't hold big public gatherings with people without masks?
Well, I think the most malign thing is where you start to attack your own experts and, suggest that maybe politicians know better than disease experts. In this case, the CDC has not been allowed to really speak out. When they tried to put information on their website, that got edited by politicians. We now have a pseudo expert advising the president. Tony Fauci is a great person. His messages are quite clear, but as he gets attacked, those messages aren't able to develop the kind of patience and helping each other that would bring the death rate down.
Let me switch over and ask you about vaccines, Bill, and get your take on where things stand there. How soon do you expect a candidate to be approved?
Well, I think likely early next year, with any luck, we'll have 2 or 3 of the 6 that are in phase 3 trials right now. The Pfizer has a good chance of being amongst the first of those. They're a very experienced vaccine company and designed their study very well. But also, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, Moderna, Sanofi. We should have choices of vaccines sometime early next year.
Do the hiccups, I guess maybe is one way to characterize it, that J&J and AstraZeneca have seen, does that concern you, or is that sort of a normal course of events?
Well, having 1 or 2 safety stops where you go in and look and see how was it related to the vaccine, that's not surprising, but these are, we need to take these things seriously. And we do have 2 of the vaccines. AstraZeneca still, the FDA trial specifically is still on a U.S. hold, and the Johnson & Johnson recently went on a U.S. hold. Now, those are very professional companies, and they'll dig into it. But if it turns out that there is a safety issue that could knock out some of the 6, and it's amazing to have 6, but some may not be efficacious, and so. It's great we have a second wave of vaccines that our foundation has been funding that come after those first 6. And so even if the first 6, 2 or 3 get approved, their effectiveness in terms of stopping you from being sick and stopping you from transmitting may not be perfect.
And I know you've talked about the need for a global distribution plan for the vaccine. I mean, what could this look like in a best case scenario, Bill? And I guess I should ask you, what would be the worst case? I mean, how could this play out?
Well, I think the likely case, which is fairly positive, is that we have enough approvals and volume in the first half of the year that by summer, we're in a very different place than we are today. The number of deaths down quite a bit, and so that we're able in the second half to almost everywhere open schools back up. We won't be completely back to normal because we won't have got to the 70% plus of the population vaccinated by then to really drive the numbers down. And as long as this disease exists anywhere in the world, the chance of reinfection will always be there. And so we need to participate for our own self-interest, for humanitarian reasons, for strategic reasons. We need to connect up with even the poorer countries and figure out how we can make sure there's enough vaccine for them.
I mean, China recently joined the COVAX initiative, which is a group of 183 countries led by the WHO that work together on development and distribution of vaccine. The U.S. has not joined, so you would anticipate maybe it would. I mean, this sort of puts China in a driver's seat, perhaps, in a way that we're not.
No. China has a number of vaccines that at a technical level look promising, but because they haven't been submitted to a gold standard regulator, they're unlikely to be used extensively outside of China itself. Now, there's a few of those that could go through a process in Europe or the US and then would join the list of options that we have for vaccines. That's only good for the entire world. The US has shown a lot of support for funding vaccines for poor countries. The US is a generous giver to a thing called Gavi that got started back in the year 2000. And so all the US has to do is make a special allocation to Gavi to procure these vaccines. And in fact, some of the bills in Congress, a Republican bill and a Democratic bill, have had sums of money for that international response. And so we're hopeful when there is a stimulus bill, which of course that's not totally clear, but that it will include this money to buy vaccines for the poor countries. That would be in alignment with the U.S.'s past history of being very generous and playing a leadership role in global health.
The administration, Bill, has meddled really in the development and release of the FDA's vaccine approval guidelines. Can Americans trust that vaccines will be properly scrutinized before approval?
Yeah, we did have a very unfortunate incident where the FDA decided that you needed to wait 2 months after you'd enrolled over half of the trial and dosed them in order to have a large enough safety database to see if there might be side effects. And for a brief period, the White House was blocking that or saying that it was inappropriate or claiming that one of the companies had objected to it, which is just not true. Eventually, the FDA did succeed in getting that in to their guidance to the companies, and the companies all have their reputations to defend. So I think if the FDA approves a vaccine, that is the gold standard compared to the regulators, and the professional staff there, is clearly on notice that they shouldn't let politicians tell them what to do.
I want to go back to that comment you made about the stimulus bill. So in other words, international funding for vaccine distribution is tied up in the stimulus bill?
Yeah, in fact, the stimulus bill is the best opportunity to get that because it'll showcase that in order to be a good citizen and stop the disease outside the United States, that the portion of resources required to do that is less than 1% of the stimulus bill, and it'll just be, amongst the various measures to help out there. I think given how distracted the country is with an election and all the problems the pandemic has brought, that no standalone bills are, getting done for anything. And so being part of that overall thing, I think that's how the people in the Congress who support these things have decided that's the most likely way for something to get done.
Interesting. Americans have become increasingly wary of vaccines, sadly. And so with this major time to be taking a vaccine next year, we hope, are you concerned about that, maybe resistance even? And is the Gates Foundation working to address that potential problem, Bill?
Well, in fact, the wave of wild stories about the vaccine, that it's, a conspiracy, it's based on evil intent, often referring to either myself or Dr. Fauci. That is a wild new element that I wouldn't have expected. And so you do have to ask, is that going to mean things like mask wearing or willingness to take the vaccine are affected? I'm still hopeful that, there's 30% of the population who understands this is to benefit other people. And so they'll go first. And that is that experience clearly is people are seeing that there's, very, very few side effects and that it's working well, that then we'll be able to get up to the 70% plus that we need, even if the vaccine's very effective, to block the kind of exponential growth in transmission and put it into an exponential decline. And so I think we'll get there, but it's more at risk than I expected because of that political interference and those political messages.
And a lot of those crazy stories are being shared, of course, on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. Have you or people from your organization been in touch with those companies to try to talk to them about mitigating the spread of that misinformation?
I think those companies are doing more now to do that. This is kind of a wild phenomena, and we've always had some awareness of about vaccines, but not this idea of connecting them to a plot, like microchipping people to track them, or things that even in a fiction story, it wouldn't be all that believable. So I hope we can get the truth to be more interesting than the sort of oversimplistic explanation of what's going on with this pandemic.
Bill, many Americans are forced to wait in line at food banks or go to non-essential jobs that expose them to COVID just to get by. Is another round of stimulus important to an effective public health response?
Yeah, I think we will get a stimulus at some point. Even the Fed chief, who's it's supposed to be a pretty non-political job, is really, and he's an economic expert, is saying that a stimulus is quite important. And of course, you're seeing the job losses as the industries that had some support, like the airlines, are now losing that support. And so the layoffs, including what state and local governments are going to have to do because they have less revenue. So they're going to have to cut their payrolls quite a bit. And you start to get, if you're not careful, into a negative cycle of the economy shrinking. So although it's, ultra confused, like most things with some of the current politicians, I'm hopeful, and in this case, the sooner the better, that we do get some type of stimulus out.
Obviously, coronavirus is a key issue in the 2020 presidential election. I know you don't like to wade into politics that much, but the two candidates have very different visions with big implications in terms of how to fight to contain the virus. I wonder if you have any thoughts on either plan and then just generally about how COVID is affecting the election.
Well, one thing that everybody may not be aware of is how fantastic the CDC has been historically. They're the best in the world. They train themselves in terms of how to communicate, including getting bad news out and getting people to take measures that protect themselves. And they've been muzzled. You don't hear from them, and they're top epidemiologists. So, if you want to hear what a politician who wants things to go well and people to praise that politician, okay, that's one approach. Or if you want to hear from people who understand diseases and disease models, that's another approach. And that there are many, many issues in this campaign, but one is a bit about, do the experts get to be the ones who are helping to set the policy, or are the experts attacked when they try and share the truth about the tough situation we still find ourselves in?
Obviously, the focus of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is public health writ large, but have you considered weighing in or advising in terms of election policy, simply because it means so many people congregating?
We're doing a lot on the tools and making sure they get done quickly, making sure that even within the country, they'll be distributed on an equitable basis as opposed to who can pay the most. We still have a terrible flaw in our testing system that the government is paying for tests where you don't get the results back within 24 hours. And it's such a waste of money, and it's helping to drive lots of infection because you don't hear your result until well after you've infected other people. And if somebody works on disease, I keep waiting for sanity. They should run the headline every day: U.S. testing system worst in the world, delayed results being paid for.
I remember early on, Bill, I think maybe it was April, you said that you didn't think things were going to get back to completely normal until the fall of 2021. And it's looking pretty prescient right now. So where do you think we'll be a year from now, October 2021? Are you still sticking with that?
Yeah, well, the slowness on the global response means that fall 2021 won't be completely back to normal. Our goal for that should be that a lot of the service jobs can be back in place, and certainly school can be back in place. But we'll have risk of it coming back into the country during that time period. I hope that there's a small chance that the great new tools, the monoclonal antibodies and the vaccines, won't show good results. The probability of that is very, very low, but it's not zero. So, we're all awaiting the effectiveness data from the 6 trials, and it's very appropriate. We have, many different approaches that at least the phase 1 and phase 2 data did look very good. I think things will be a lot different, closer to normal than to what they are today.
And finally, Bill, your father passed away recently, and our condolences to you for that, and your family. And I don't know if you remember, but in 2009, I visited with you and him in Paris and interviewed both of you for a cover story in Fortune magazine. So that was a lot of fun. And I know your dad was critical in terms of the creation and the mission of the foundation. What was his role in the creation and the mission, and what was his influence on you?
Yeah, he played a critical role in many respects. One is his example, is his book he wrote called Showing Up for Life, that talked a lot about volunteering, civic duty. So even I was growing up, my parents were involved in every, Planned Parenthood, United Way, Municipal League, you name it, and, felt that was important. They talked a lot about philanthropy and giving, but even more concretely, when I endowed the foundation with the first 20 billion, I was still full-time at Microsoft. And so it was my dad and Patty Stonecipher, a great Microsoft executive that Melinda and I knew and trusted. It was the two of them in partnership that created the foundation and got it going and did a great job, so that as I got more time free and eventually moved over to the foundation full-time in 2008, a lot had been accomplished there. And the whole tone, the modesty, the integrity that my dad had this very positive influence that endures to this day.
Bill Gates, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your work, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.
I'm Anjali Kimlani, senior reporter here, covering all things healthcare, which means everything COVID as well. And that gives me the responsibility and the pleasure to introduce you to someone who needs no introduction, Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start off with a debate I'd like you to settle for me, please, and that is, right now we're looking at skyrocketing cases across the country, setting daily records at more than 80,000 cases per day. People are saying that this is a third wave, but I seem to have missed that. So I'd like for you to settle this for me. We're in the third peak, clearly. What wave are we in? Is this an elongated first, a second, a third? Please.
I look at it more as an elongated and exacerbation of the original first wave. If you look at when we got hit badly, which was dominated early on by the Northeastern corridor, particularly the New York metropolitan area, the cases went way up and then came back down to a baseline of about 20,000 cases. So we never really cleared and got down to a very low baseline, which I would consider to be less than 10,000 per day, maybe just a couple of thousand per day. So we stayed at 20. Then you remember when we tried to, quote, open up the economy again and open up the country, there were several states that did that in a somewhat varied way. Some did not adhere very well to the proposed guidelines. And what you saw, particularly along the southern states, Florida, Georgia, Texas, Southern California, Arizona, we started to see a peak that brought us up to around 70,000 per day. Then it came back down again only to about 30 to 40,000 and was stuck at around 40,000 for several weeks to, if not a month or more. And now as we're getting into the cold weather, we came back up again to the worst that we've ever had, which was over 80,000 per day. So if you look at the chart, which you just showed, we've never really had waves in the sense of up and then down to a good baseline. It's been up and wavering up and down till now we're at the highest baseline we've ever been, which is really quite precarious. So, it's kind of semantics. You want to call it the third wave or an extended first wave. No matter how you look at it, it's not good news.
That's a very sobering, and thank you for settling that. We look at, you for guidance for all of what is going on and the advice that you've given, the mitigation strategies. And it seems like you've been able to really get that message out there and directed it to a number of very segmented audiences. We've seen just how insulated some populations are in this country as a result of this pandemic. How do you decide to, take on some of the media requests when it comes to, shows with celebrities or children's shows? I've seen you on a couple of these and you make all the time for it, but what goes into that decision of targeting these specific groups?
Well, I try, and my colleagues also. I believe that public communication, when you're in the middle of a serious situation as we are now with this historic pandemic, is absolutely essential. And you try to get to various segments of society. So, I think you brought up a good point. I've done things where you appeal to children to try to get them to understand without frightening them the crisis that we're going through. You also want to get to the people who are out in the front lines who are putting themselves at risk. You also want to make sure that the healthcare providers realize how much we appreciate them and the risk that they're taking. But you also have to get to another group that I think is a bit more problematic, the people who, for one reason or other, are getting the misinterpretation that public health measures are in conflict with a healthy society in the sense of economically. It's kind of pitting the economic interest against the health interest. And I try and get the point across as often as I possibly can that we shouldn't look at public health measures as something that's an obstacle to the economy. It's a safe and prudent way to get the economy open again. We're not talking about shutting anything down, because often when people hear you want to implement things like universal wearing of masks, physical distance, avoiding crowds, that we're talking about the extreme of shutting society down. We absolutely are not talking about that. We want public health measures to be the gateway or the roadway to safely and prudently opening up the economy again. So you could have both. You could have good public health measures and you could still leave the economy open. But when you do extremes, when you say either shut down or do anything you want to do, it doesn't work that way. There's got to be a mean in the middle there where you can do both.
And that's a message that you've definitely been driving in. And unfortunately, against your best efforts, you've also met with some pushback either from the public or even from the president. And so I wonder, as you continue to tirelessly send out these messages, you're also met with having lived through, unfortunately, a very public experience of what many of us fear, which is the toxic work environment. And you've said you've stuck strictly to business on this front, but I wonder, does it undermine your message to have the president constantly say things that are the exact opposite of what you're saying?
Well, I would say it's certainly not helpful, but that's something that I really don't think I should be, wringing my hands about what I do, since there's a limited amount of time in the day, and to just get your energy focused, as I say, like a laser on what the proper and appropriate public health measure is, and hope that people hear you and understand that adhering to public health measures now is going to make it easier and more quickly getting to where we want to go, is to approaching some form of normality. Luckily, despite the fact that we're dealing with a very, very challenging period right now, even more so as we enter the cooler months of the fall and the colder months of the winter, that vaccines are proceeding at a very good pace, and we should be on time to get an answer. And I think it'll be a positive answer by the end of this year, the end of November, the beginning of December, so that we can start distributing vaccine to those who are most in need, particularly healthcare workers and the vulnerable among us in the population. So that will help a lot, but it's not going to be solving the problem by itself. We will not be able to abandon prudent public health measures for quite some time right now. We've got to make sure that's going to be part of what we do without closing the country, without closing the economy. We can do this. I'm absolutely convinced if as a nation we pull together and do some fundamental common denominator public health measures, that we can get through this with a lot of help in the future from vaccines and adequate therapies.
I'm glad you brought up the vaccines, because that's definitely something, everyone is focused on, especially as we know the deadline is coming to get some of those interim results and first looks at the data. I wonder about the effectiveness. That's something that has been a topic of conversation, and I've heard a broad range of commentary from, it will block the virus entirely to it will simply diminish, the most severe cases. And if anyone experiences the virus, it will actually just be a sort of a milder version. So based on what you know right now and what you're seeing, do you anticipate that the first sets of vaccines out the door will be more of a less effective blocker of the virus?
Well, that's a great question, and that's the primary endpoint of most of the virus, is to prevent clinical disease, to prevent symptomatic disease, not necessarily to prevent infection. That's a secondary endpoint. But the primary thing you want to do is that if people get infected, prevent them from getting sick. And if you prevent them from getting sick, you will ultimately prevent them from getting seriously ill. So that's what we want to do. The first point, which we call a primary endpoint, is that if the vaccine also allows you to prevent initial infection, that would be great. But what I would settle for, and all of my colleagues would settle for, is the primary endpoint to prevent clinically recognizable disease. And that's what we hope happens. And if we do, that will go a long way to diffusing this very difficult crisis that we're in.
Of course, and going to the point that you've made that the vaccine won't be the end of the story, definitely mitigation tactics will remain in place for some time. Going on to the trials themselves, it seems like the UK is setting up to do a challenge trial, and while we already have some vaccines in late-stage trials here, it does seem that with the number of candidates out there, there's some room for using this strategy. Is the US setting up to do a challenge trial as well?
You know, we really don't think that that's necessary. When you have so many infections, I mean, we're having in this country, as we started the discussion off, with over 80,000 infections per day. Fundamentally, when you do challenge studies, there are a number of reasons, one of the most important of which is that there's not enough disease activity out there for your vaccine trial to give you a definitive answer. And even though challenge studies may have a place under certain circumstances, it's not the same as the actual circumstances with which a person gets naturally infected. So although you can get some good information from a challenge trial, the real world information that you want is out in the field when someone is actually being exposed to natural infection, and to determine if the vaccine prevents against that. So right now, we're not planning any challenge studies because we have so much infection going on. We have 5 or 6 vaccines that will be in trial in the midst of these 80,000 per day infection. I think we're going to get enough information that we need to make a decision as to the safety and the efficacy of a vaccine without resorting to a challenge trial.
Okay, and speaking of that an unfortunate number of cases in this country, we know that with the cases rising, you know, being in contact with people is getting more dangerous. When we look at sort of the political climate we're in, having to deal with the campaigning, we still see rallies happening. And I just wonder, you know, with the recent reports of aides to Vice President Mike Pence being positive, should these rallies be canceled at this point, this close to the election day?
Well, you know, I'm not going to comment on whether this or that rally should be canceled, except to repeat what I've said many, many times, and I'll repeat it here, that we should avoid as best as possible congregate settings where you have people who are crowded together. If that happens, it should be outdoors, and if that happens, it should be with virtually everybody wearing a mask. So, you know, there are 5 things that I talk about all the time: universal wearing of masks, keeping distance, avoiding congregate settings, avoiding as best as possible indoor things where there are crowded people indoors, and wash your hands as often as possible. That goes for any circumstance, no matter where it is and who's doing it.
Speaking of the campaigns, we know that Election Day is near, and there is either going to be a continuation of this administration or a change. I just wonder what that means for you and your work, what a continuation of the Trump administration means versus what expectations you have of a Biden administration when it comes to dealing with the coronavirus.
Well, from my standpoint, I'm going to be continuing to do exactly the same things that I'm doing right now, putting a lot of effort into getting safe and effective vaccines, as well as better treatments. We have some good treatments. We can do better. We have a number of clinical trials that are going on for early infection to prevent the need for hospitalization. That's not going to change no matter what administration is in. And my message, which is a consistent message, will not change because it really transcends whatever administration. The message is the same. the kind of prudent and careful public health measures that I believe will be able to contain the surges that we're seeing right now. None of that's going to change.
It seems like whatever you do does have some level of insulation from some outside forces. We've unfortunately not seen that with the FDA and CDC. And going global, we've also seen the U.S. sort of miss out in participation with some of these vaccine efforts and other responses. I just wonder, we heard Bill Gates earlier talking about how China is not, in fact, in the driver's seat when it comes to the vaccine. But when it comes to the work that your agency can do, if a country like China does in fact get more attention, does that sway the ability of the U.S. and your agency specifically to do research going forward, to have a commanding voice on the response to the virus?
Not at all. I mean, we the NIH and our biomedical research community has always been, is now, and I hope will always be, the dominating biomedical research force in the world. And just about everybody admits that. That's not changed. Whether China does what China wants to do or Russia does what Russia wants to do, what we do with regard to science, the development of therapeutics, the development of vaccines, is something that the world has always looked upon us for leadership, and it continues to this day.
When you talk to some of your foreign peers, I'm sure you're in constant contact. Is there anything that we could be doing better and should be implementing, or other strategies that we haven't tried yet?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I am in close contact with my scientific colleagues and my public health colleagues, which long antedated COVID-19. So those relationships stay the same. The part of your question, when you look at what we've done, could we've done anything different? It really depends on what you mean. From a scientific standpoint, I think what is going to turn out, and I hope so, I don't want to get overconfident in it, but I think one of the real successes that we're going to see over the next couple of months is what's happened in the arena of vaccines, as well as, in some extent, newer and better therapeutics. So I think we can look forward to something positive there. Could we have done things better from a public health standpoint? Of course. Whenever you're dealing with a very difficult situation like that, you can always look back and say there were things that we could have done better and that we should have done better. But that's just the nature of the situation we're in. I think anyone who says, no, we've done everything perfectly is really not looking at the reality of the fact that when you have such challenges like that, whether you're in Europe or in Asia or in the United States, we could always look back and say we could have done a better job.
Certainly, and with the changing information, I've said often we are watching the scientific process, under a very public light in a way we never have before, and I think everyone's privy to that now. Looking at some of the things we've learned, I think this is something that still weighs on some people's minds. Or what exactly should we be doing? So, for example, bringing your groceries in, is that something that you should still be wiping down your mail? What do you do, Dr. Fauci?
I get asked that question all the time. Well, we know that this virus overwhelmingly, predominantly is transmitted by the respiratory route, by either droplets that are large enough essentially to travel to get to someone's nose, eyes, mouth, or aerosol a little bit. We don't know exactly what the extent of the aerosol is. We know it does play a role. Exactly how much is still being worked out. We also know that the virus can live on inanimate objects. But if you look at the transmissibility, the epidemiology that we have a lot of experience now, that is very likely a very, very minor aspect of transmissibility. We can't say it's zero. It certainly is real and is finite, but it's minor. So I think we should spend less time worrying about wiping down a grocery bag than we should about just washing our hands frequently. So you ask me what I do when I come from the grocery store, or when someone gives me a takeout bag, which I do a lot now because I don't go into restaurants and sit down. I want to keep them going financially, so I do a lot of takeout. So I do have a bag that I bring into my house. Instead of worrying about the bag, I'll open the bag and then I'll just wash my hands thoroughly, which is what you should do. I think doing that natural public health measure and not worrying about touching things, things that might or might not have anything to do with transmissibility. Just focus on washing your hands.
Well, thank you for answering that one. That was a personal one for me. Dr. Anthony Fauci, thank you again for your time. Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and the U.S.'s top epidemiologist. Thank you again.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.